Well, it's been a long time coming, Sunny Gyms, but DUSK is finally released. The old school inspired first-person shooter developed by New Blood Interactive. A game that takes the best parts of everything we loved about the shooters of yesteryear and does its best to bring it to a modern audience. So if you've been following my channel for a while now, you'll know that I've been a pretty big fan of DUSK since that first pre-alpha demo they released a couple of years ago, and ever since then it's been a slow but steady progress of new content being released. It is kind of hard for me to talk about this thing without repeating myself because I have done a couple of videos on it already, but I'm going to mostly pretend this is the first time you're hearing me talk about it. And hopefully you're one of those lucky people who's playing all 3 episodes for the first time without interruption. Now the story as I understand it is that you're the DUSK dude, a treasure hunter coming to the small town of DUSK for his latest venture, before you get drawn into this bizarre and mysterious cult of weirdos and have to fight for your survival. Like a lot of games from that 90s time period, especially shooters, we don't really get all that much of a story or a narrative, though that's very much keeping in line with the style of the time. So don't expect long cinematics or walls of text to fill in the blanks. About all the story you get is the intermission screens at the end of each episode, and even then it's pretty ambiguous and minimalistic stuff. If you look at DUSK in terms of the theme and content, it seems primarily a lot like Blood and Redneck Rampage, with the theme of all the cultists worshipping some kind of bizarre religion very similar to the Cabal worshipping the evil god Chernobog in Blood. In fact, the main character's appearance in DUSK with the hat and coat is also kind of similar to Caleb's as well. Then I think the backwater theme with the various farms, the silos and mines you visit in the first episode is reminiscent of some of the environments from 1997's Redneck Rampage. In the second episode, the military becomes more prominent as they're trying to contain the situation, which kinda mirrors the arrival of the HECU in Half-Life. The appearance of the soldiers in DUSK even kinda looks a bit like the Marines as well. And then it seems like they even managed to squeeze in a super hot homage, with a power-up in the second episode where time only moves when you do. And then at one point it even references Thief the Dark Project. Visually, the way the game looks, with the very polygonal character and weapon models, combined with the fast movement speed and ease of bunny hopping, mirrors the movement controls in Quake. And on top of that, you can customize the shit out of the engine to make it look as good or bad as you want, even pixelating the whole thing to make it look like an early 90s title. There's no cancerous settings though, like chromatic aberration, depth of field, or motion blur. And if you're the type of person who'd even be upset these aren't included, well, you're dead to me. You can also set your FOV to a ludicrously high amount if you're the type of person who likes playing the game as if you're looking through a fisheye lens. And it's good that a lot of those boxes for visual customization have been ticked. There's also definitely a sense here of making everything feel as fluid and accessible as possible, and one of the first things you notice is just how sharp and responsive the controls are. Like, it just feels good to play and there's no kind of input delay or slugginess with any aspect of the movement. What this all results in is this pastiche of various first-person shooters from around the mid to late 90s, but then it still manages to make itself feel unique and different despite all of this. You get all the tools of the trade too, including pistols, shotguns, a machine gun, rifle, crossbow, and what's basically a grenade and rocket launcher, that the game calls a riveter. Now this might be the most gloriously overpowered gun in any FPS I can think of recently. It's a rocket launcher type weapon that shoots exploding rivets, and if the sheer damage output this thing can dish out wasn't enough for you, well, it can also fire super fast. It just melts most standard enemies and can chew through boss type enemies pretty quickly too. So in lieu of a BFG type gun, it's a pretty good consolation. Any FPS game worth its salt knows you need a good shotgun, and DUSK has 2 of them. A lever action shotgun which can be dual welded, and then of course a super shotgun. A double barreled monstrosity that is lethal at point blank range, and probably makes the cultists wish they'd stayed in bed that day. I think the underappreciated guns are the crossbow and the hunting rifle. The crossbow fires a bolt that can pierce through multiple enemies, and the hunting rifle may as well be a goddamn railgun, because of the fire rate and the damage it does. It's able to one-shot most weaker enemies, which is always nice. Then the machine gun is more of a workhorse kind of weapon. Like, it's not that it's bad, it's just the damage output is kinda weak. You just kinda use this thing to mow down a lot of the weaker type enemies, and as a result, it can feel underpowered. The only thing I think is a bit of a bummer here is that DUSK shows its hand way too early, giving you access to all of the weapons in the first episode. There's even a secret in the second level of the game, which I don't think is too hard to find, that gives you almost every single weapon as well, making the entire first episode just trivial in difficulty. A lot of the older games would usually limit the amount of weapons you got in the first episode, usually because it worked off the shareware model which was given away for free. Doom, Blood, Shadow Warrior and Duke Nukem 3D all did this, and you usually only got like the first 5 or so weapons. In Doom that was the chainsaw, the pistol, the shotgun, the chain gun and the rocket launcher. In Blood it was the pitchfork, the flare gun, the shotgun, the Tommy gun and the napalm launcher. Here in DUSK though, you get everything right from the beginning, and I think it just does kind of downplay the fun of using some of the more powerful weapons, because they're so readily available that it removes a bit of the mystique from acquiring them. Like getting your hands on a plasma gun in Doom for the first time for instance, or the Devastator in Duke Nukem 3D, it just made you feel like death incarnate. But I am just being a kind of a nitpicking asshole here, and all of the weapons in DUSK are still awesome to use. And they can turn most enemies into a shower of red mist, so there's not all that much to complain about. DUSK is broken up between 3 episodes. You've got the foothills, the facilities, and the nameless city, which is the one that's just come out. And I kind of compare these to the episodes in Doom, comparing them to Knee Deep in the Dead, On the Shores of Hell, and Inferno. And the reason I do that is because they're very similar in terms of the progression of the architecture and the level design. Most of the areas in the foothills, for instance, are pretty much grounded in reality, like you're exploring farms, silos, mines, that kind of thing. They're based off more realistic looking locations. By the time you get to the facilities, you'll start to see this otherworldly influence in the level design, and there's environments that push this boundary between the real world and the more alien and bizarre looking locations that serve as a way of explaining the backstory. This episode introduces the Wendigos, the Mummers, and of course Big John. When you're in the nameless city though, all bets are off, and every single level is different from the last. Much in the same way as Doom's Inferno, where they could just create anything they wanted and throw any kind of enemy at us, that's what's happened here with the Nameless City, with environments and creatures that just start to defy convention and explanation. Without spoiling much of it, because I really think people should experience this thing for themselves, there's just stuff in this episode that had me exclaiming loudly out of reflex. Like I'd see something really awesome in the game and then just shout something out loud without realizing. That's the reaction that some of the sequences in this episode elicit. Like, at one point there's a bit where you just come out of this ruined church and a giant tornado comes out of nowhere and just rips the place to the ground. It's cool too, because at a point in the game when you're feeling like a badass, this short sequence reminds you of the real forces at work here, and you remember that you're just a really small cog in a very big wheel. There's a voice actor who makes an appearance at one point, and I don't want to say who it is, but if you're a fan of 90s FPS games, well, it's gonna give you goosebumps. Like, I actually had shivers when I realized who it was. You can see too the progression from episode to episode, how Dave Szymanski has become more and more proficient with creating maps. And episode 3 I think is the definite highlight, save for one particular level later in the game which I think is dog shit, but otherwise it's just amazing stuff. Overall, I think episode 2 is the weakest episode in the game, only because it kind of drifts between what's been achieved in episode 1 and episode 3, look, which is deliberate, but it makes it feel less unique than the other episodes. This was a similar problem with the second episode in Doom. Episode 1 is mysterious and a lot more interesting because of it, because you're slowly descending into more bizarre situations and environments, trying to piece together what's happening. Often off little more than just bizarre scribblings on walls, and creepy utterings from some unseen deity that seems to be tormenting you. Episode 2 still has some pretty good levels though, like I think the one where you first encounter the Wendigos is just amazing, and likely to make you shit your pants. Also, the level around that giant reactor with all of the jump pads is just balls to the wall fun, and it's a level that's just chock full of assholes to kill. But the stuff in the first and third episode I think just trumps it. DUSK has 5 difficulty modes. You've got easy, normal, hard, very hard, and Duskmare, where you die in a single hit. Very hard, or Sierra Miedo as the game calls it, warns you that it's not intended for a first time playthrough, but I gotta say that I don't actually agree with this. This is the difficulty mode that feels like the way the game is meant to be played. Enemies move and fire projectiles faster, and you also take more damage, but it feels like a justified challenge, considering you can mitigate or just avoid most damage if you're agile enough. So this to me is the only difficulty mode worth playing, with the others beneath it reserved for small children, the elderly, and teenagers who do that Fortnite dance in public.
Schwacked.
This mode just reminds me that the enemies in this game don't like me. The world sucks and people smell. Part of what also makes DUSK seem so awesome has to be the soundtrack by my boy Andrew Hulshult. Now there's 43 or so tracks in the soundtrack and every single one of them is different from the last, but they're all connected in just how awesome and memorable they are. The production quality and the music itself is on par, if not better, than the kind of thing you'd hear in most AAA games, and it just really propels the whole thing to another level. Some of the music gives me a real Sonic Mayhem vibe from Quake 3 with these thumping tracks that fit in perfectly with the chaotic and violent shooting. And then other tracks are more ambient and mysterious, tapping into the game's theme of this evil and mysterious cult, and the otherworldly beings that these guys worship. It sounds like a combination of what Trent Reznor pulled off with Quake 1 combined with the soundscape that Eric Brosius created for the Thief games. And it can be downright spooky at times when enemies aren't present and you're moving through darkened corridors with this atmosphere really heightened by the music. It just never falls into the habit of being one metal track after the other, and it means the game is constantly throwing different motifs at the player, keeping every level and every song sounding different. This is a good thing. All up, DUSK will probably take around 2 to 3 hours per episode, and you've got 3 episodes all up, so you're looking at around 8 or 9 hours roughly for a first time playthrough. What's kinda good though is that the game really does encourage and facilitate replaying levels. You can get trophies on each level by getting through them without killing anything or getting through without taking a single hit. And then there's a completionist trophy for finding all the secrets and killing every single enemy. And on top of that, the level select screen allows you to customize your loadout before the level itself. And it's nice not having to start from scratch in that regard, just to go back to that one level where you missed that one bastard secret. There's an endless mode as well, where you just fight an increasingly more difficult set of enemies until you either die or get bored, so that's fun too. So in case I hadn't made it obvious, I think DUSK is a pretty kick-ass game. I'm lucky enough to have met the guys who work on this thing, and they're a bunch of like-minded guys who seem to love what they do and tried to bring that across into the development. And you know what? I think they've achieved that. So unless you're a jaded asshole that just hates indie throwback games because your parents never loved you, I'd say this one is definitely worth picking up. It's been a long time coming, but I'd say it's been worth the wait.